It is 01:17 a.m. local time across 6 time zones simultaneously. And in the radar rooms, the operations centers, the darkened command posts stretched from the Polish border all the way east to the Ural foothills, something unprecedented is beginning to take shape. Not a single strike, not a probe, not a test, but a synchronized wave of violence launched outward from Ukraine in every direction at once. And nobody on the Russian side has seen anything quite like it before. Because what is happening in these early hours of June 6, 2026 is not a retaliatory gesture or a symbolic statement. It is a preemptive operation of a scale that analysts will spend the next decade studying in detail. Let's go back to the beginning. In the final week of May, Russia launched what Ukrainian officials described as some of the heaviest aerial bombardments since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. 3 consecutive nights, back-to-back, relentless, in which Russian forces sent cascading waves of Shahed drones and ballistic missiles screaming toward Ukrainian cities. And on the night of June 2nd alone, the barrage that struck Kyiv and Dnipro killed at least 23 civilians and wounded more than 100, collapsing a 9-story residential building in Kyiv's Podolsky district, cutting electricity to 140,000 residents and striking 4 medical facilities in the capital with the kind of precision that says this wasn't accidental. It was deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. In Dnipro, the carnage was worse. 16 people dead in a single city in a single night, apartment blocks gutted, streets filled with shattered glass and the sound of emergency sirens that by this point in the war no longer cause panic but simply signaled that another terrible night has arrived. Russia's defense ministry called the attack a response to Ukrainian operations inside Russian territory. But here is what the Kremlin either failed to calculate or simply didn't care about. Ukraine was watching, Ukraine was tracking, and Ukraine was already preparing what would become known as Operation Spiderweb, a deep strike campaign against Russian air power at its source, targeting the very airfields from which those drones and missiles were being launched. And so, in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, while Russian air defense operators were still running post-strike assessments from their previous attacks, Ukraine's general staff authorized a preemptive strike unlike anything the war had produced before. At 01:34 a.m., the first wave departs. Not missiles, not conventional aircraft, but drones, hundreds of them, long-range FPV and strike variants that have been quietly positioned over preceding days along supply chains that Russia doesn't fully map, from staging points that exist only briefly before dissolving back into the countryside. The targets are specific, precise, and chosen not for symbolic value but for maximum operational disruption. Russian military airfields, the hangars and hardstands where T-95 Bear bombers and Iskander launcher vehicles sit between sorties, the fuel and ammunition depots that keep Russia's aerial terror campaign running night after night. At 01:51 a.m., the first confirmed strike hits the Bryansk airfield, and a Russian helicopter, the type used for forward observation and reconnaissance support, is documented by Ukrainian drone footage erupting in a column of fire and black smoke that climbs 300 feet into the night sky. The explosion is not just destructive, it is a signal. We have reached you here, inside Russia, and we will reach you everywhere. But Bryansk is only the beginning. Simultaneously, on the other side of the map, in St. Petersburg, the city that is also home to the annual economic forum that Vladimir Putin personally promoted as a showcase of Russia's resilience, often dubbed Putin's Davos, Ukrainian long-range drones were already inbound. They struck the St. Petersburg oil terminal, one of the largest oil transshipment complexes in all of northwestern Russia, a facility that handles a crucial percentage of Russian fuel exports and supplies logistics chains that stretch deep into Europe and Asia. The terminal ignites. Satellite imagery captured within hours shows a plume of black smoke visible from space rising above the historic skyline of a city that Putin had hand-picked as the backdrop for projecting economic strength to the world. 2 Russian firefighters died trying to contain the blaze. Dozens of international flights were delayed as St. Petersburg's airport restricted airspace. The economic forum proceeded, but the message was already written in smoke above the rooftops. Ukraine can reach you there. Ukraine can reach you anywhere. Meanwhile, back at the front, the situation that has been building for months in the Kupyansk direction is reaching something close to a breaking point. This stretch of the Kharkiv Oblast front has been a slow, grinding pressure point since late 2025, with Russian forces pushing steadily west from the Oskil River, attempting to envelop Kupyansk from multiple angles, applying the same patient, casualty-intensive tactics that have defined the Russian ground war since the early Bakhmut campaigns. Advance, absorb losses, advance again. Grind the defenders down not through maneuver, but through sheer attrition of numbers. On June 5th, the Ukrainian General Staff confirmed clashes near Novoplatoniivka and along approaches towards Kupyansk, Kyivshadivka, and Novo-Osinove. 3 separate engagements in a compressed geographic area that together paint a picture of Russian pressure from the northeast that has not relented in weeks. What makes Kupyansk significant is not just its tactical position, but what its loss would mean operationally. It's a rail hub, a logistics node, the kind of town that if it falls, changes the geometry of the entire northern front and forces Ukraine into a much longer defensive line with fewer natural obstacles. Ukrainian commanders know this. Russian commanders know this. And so the fighting around it is particularly brutal. Small unit engagements in tree line and village outskirts, artillery exchanges that leave nothing standing, drone versus drone battles fought 50 meters above fields that once grew sunflowers and wheat and now grow nothing but craters. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, a different kind of pressure has been building since January when Russian forces began probing the former Kakhovka reservoir basin, the dried lakebed left behind after Russia detonated the Nova Kakhovka Dam in 2023. Using it as a concealed approach route to flank Ukrainian positions near Stepnohirsky, west of Oreshnik. By June 5th, the Ukrainian General Staff was confirming active clashes near Stepnohirsky and also near Rybne, Dobropilya, Varvarivka, Sviatopetropivka, and a half-dozen other settlements along the Huliapole axis. Names that barely register in Western news cycles, but each represent a community of people, a line that someone is dying to hold and someone else is dying to cross. The Russian approach here is consistent. Accumulate assault groups in concealed positions, probe the forward edge repeatedly to identify weak points, then commit reserves to exploit any gap that opens, all while keeping Ukrainian forces pinned down with constant artillery and drone pressure so they cannot rotate, cannot reinforce, cannot rest. Ukrainian drone forces have been the single most effective countermeasure in this environment, not because any individual strike is decisive, but because the cumulative effect of constant surveillance and strike capability means Russian assault groups cannot mass without being seen and engaged, and the cost of each Russian advance in armor and infantry is driven up to levels that in any previous century of warfare would have made the entire campaign untenable. And this is exactly what analysts mean when they say Ukraine is changing the character of war, not with exotic technology alone, but with the systematic application of cheap, proliferated drone capability against an adversary that has more men than it can sensibly spend, but also cannot simply stop spending them without conceding ground that its political leadership has publicly claimed as Russian territory. Back in the air war, the Russian response to Ukraine's June 6th preemptive strikes was not a pause or a recalculation, it was escalation. By the early morning hours, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed it had launched a mass missile and drone attack against Ukraine, more than 400 drones and over 40 missiles, a barrage that President Zelensky described in a nationally broadcast address as a cynical strike against ordinary cities. 4 people were killed, including first responders who had rushed to assist victims of initial impacts and were caught in the follow-on waves, a Russian targeting practice that Ukrainian emergency services have documented repeatedly, the deliberate secondary strike timed to kill the people trying to help. 80 more were wounded across the country. Ukraine's air defenses intercepted the vast majority of the incoming projectiles, but in a strike of that scale, even a small percentage of penetrating missiles translates to collapsed buildings, severed power lines, and bodies pulled from rubble. The Russian Defense Ministry described its attack as a response to Operation Spiderweb and claimed the designated targets were hit. But this framing deserves scrutiny. Russia was already conducting 3 consecutive nights of mass strikes before Spiderweb occurred, so the timeline of escalation does not support the narrative of Russian reaction. What the evidence shows is a pattern of deliberate, continuous aerial terror against Ukrainian population centers paired with now routine Ukrainian deep strikes against Russian military infrastructure. A cycle in which Russia is simultaneously the initiator and the party absorbing strategic cost, because while Russian missiles can kill Ukrainian civilians and damage infrastructure that can eventually be rebuilt, Ukrainian drones are destroying the oil terminals, military aircraft, and supply depots that fund and enable the Russian war machine. The economic arithmetic increasingly favors Ukraine. A Ukrainian drone strike costs a fraction of a percent of the assets it is destroying, while each Russian Oreshnik hypersonic missile or Kinzhal, weapons that Putin has publicly boasted about as unstoppable, represents tens of millions of dollars consumed in a single flight. Western officials and analysts confirmed in reporting from this week that Ukrainian drone operations are actively pinning down Russian troop movements on the front line, choking logistics in occupied territories, and disrupting oil facilities deep inside Russia that provide the revenue Moscow needs to sustain the entire military effort. At a strategic level, the war that Russia thought would last 3 days and that NATO officials initially feared might see Kyiv fall within 72 hours has instead entered its 5th year as a grinding war of economic attrition in which Russia has numerical advantages in manpower and artillery but faces mounting structural problems, a defense budget that now consumes an estimated 40% of federal expenditure, a workforce hollowed out by mobilization and emigration, inflation running hot, and sanctions that, despite adaptation and workaround, have meaningfully degraded Russia's ability to import the microelectronics and precision components that modern weapon systems require. Ukraine, meanwhile, has developed a domestic drone production capacity that Western analysts describe as genuinely impressive given the wartime conditions, factories dispersed and protected, production rates climbing monthly, and a military-industrial innovation ecosystem that has turned desperation into capability. The Flamingo missile program, Ukrainian designed and increasingly fielded in operational numbers, represents exactly this kind of homegrown deterrence. A weapon Russia cannot simply neutralize by interdicting Western supply chains because it originates inside Ukraine itself. When Ukraine launched its Flamingo strikes earlier this week against targets in Russian-held territory, the strike was designed not just to damage specific installations, but to demonstrate that Ukraine possesses a missile capability that Russia cannot sanction away, cannot negotiate away, and cannot shoot down with the reliability that would make its use strategically irrational for Kyiv. There is also the matter of the Russian warship struck in dry dock during Ukraine's St. Petersburg operation on June 3rd. Satellite imagery confirmed smoke rising from a Russian corvette that was being serviced when Ukrainian drones found it. A ship that was in theory safely docked inside Russia's second-largest city behind layers of air defense far from the front. The fact that it was struck, documented, and destroyed while in dry dock is a message about reach, about the effective range of Ukraine's strike capability, and about the psychological cost being imposed on the Russian Navy, which has already lost its Black Sea flagship and has repositioned significant naval assets hundreds of kilometers east precisely because keeping them in proximity to Ukraine was too expensive. None of this is to suggest that Ukraine is on the verge of a decisive military breakthrough. The front lines have been largely static for months, and the kind of rapid territorial advances that characterized the Kharkiv liberation in September 2022 or the Kherson withdrawal in November 2022 do not appear imminent in either direction. What is changing is the underlying logic of the conflict. Russia's aerial campaign is destroying Ukrainian infrastructure and killing civilians, and it is simultaneously being absorbed by a Ukrainian society that has demonstrated a remarkable and historically unusual capacity for wartime resilience. Not because Ukrainians don't suffer, they absolutely do, but because the suffering has not produced the political fracture, the demand for capitulation, the collapse of will that Russian strategy depends upon. And meanwhile, each Ukrainian deep strike inside Russia is imposing strategic cost, narrowing the economic and military gap between the two sides and demonstrating to Western allies that Ukraine is a capable partner worth continued support. The ceasefire negotiations that have been discussed for months have produced no framework that either side finds acceptable, in large part because Russia's territorial demands, which Ukrainian officials say include not just the areas Russia already occupies, but also demands that Ukraine surrender its right to future NATO membership and limit its military forces, are demands that Ukraine's government has said it cannot accept without effectively ending Ukrainian sovereignty in any meaningful sense. In that context, the war continues because neither side has reached the threshold where the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of the available settlement terms. And on June 6, 2026, the fourth anniversary of some of the war's most consequential weeks, the trajectory points toward continued intensity. Russia will strike again. Ukraine will strike back deeper, the drones will keep flying, the oil will keep burning. And somewhere in a command post near Kupyansk or Oreshnik or along the Dnipro River line, soldiers are holding a position that nobody in the outside world has heard of, watching their drone feeds, waiting for the next contact, doing the thing that armies do when grand strategy reduces itself to the most basic human scale. They hold.